Welcome back. We're going to be looking next at political beliefs and behaviors, learning and thinking about politics, and some more medium-term and short-term forces that influence how we come to learn about politics. The next one is going to seem pretty obvious to you. However, I want to emphasize that our educational process is very important to understanding how much we learn about the American political process. School matters in many ways for later political development and the relationship with government because of the structure, rules, rewards, and punishments that we see in school. Again, as you might be seeing a common thread here, that the hierarchies and the structure that we see in our families, we see in our religion, and we also see in our education, also influences our relationship with the government in terms of how we might think it should be organized, as well as how it relates to us. So classroom emphases on social studies and civics, including applications like mock elections, lead to more political learning. We know that in a lot of cases that schools that emphasize more civics-based education will ultimately lead individuals to engage with the political process more. So I want to show you, for example, a link to a video from the C-SPAN archives that looks specifically at mock elections in the 1992 presidential campaign. The important thing to keep in mind is these types of mock elections that are either held, for example, nationwide or in schools, where school might, for example, bring in mock voting machines to get students to vote in a presidential election, are very important for socializing or making young people learn about the political process. We know, for example, that programs like We the People, as well as other ones that encourage individuals to get involved in the civic life of their communities, are so critical for later political growth, development, and participation. So I encourage you to check out this video, and hopefully it is helpful for thinking about a little bit deeper how our educational processes in the United States encourage our political thoughts and beliefs. So when we think about mock elections and when we think about what we learned in our high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, a couple of things to keep in mind here. Schools that devote less time to civics education compared to other subjects are much more likely to encourage students not to participate in the political process later. So for example, we know that nationwide, public schools spend approximately 45 minutes per week on civics instruction. In this particular instance, this could explain why many portions of the electorate, many portions of the population do not engage with the political process, because they don't have the tools and education and knowledge necessary to understand politics or feel confident in their political beliefs, something we'll be looking at a little bit later on in this lecture. When a person gets to college, though, the factors become a little bit different in terms of understanding how individuals come to affiliate with the political process. So college education, for example, leads individuals to become more progressive and liberal. There are a couple of reasons why. First is that there's exposure to different information. So we know that in our communities or on our Facebook feeds or in our Snapchats or Twitter feeds, that ultimately we're surrounded by individuals who think like us. That these individuals not only might like the same sports teams that we do or like the same food that we do, but also probably think about politics in very similar ways. We also know that we grow up in neighborhoods where individuals also think quite a bit like us. So when we get to college, when students get to college, they're exposed in an environment to many different ideas from their professors as well as from individuals from different walks of life. And because of that, oftentimes more conservative viewpoints can change and become more progressive in that way. And these liberalizing effects extend beyond college. I've included a link here to illustrate how these liberalizing effects can continue past college life. This data from the Pew Research Center illustrates that there is a very wide ideological gap between more and less educated adults. So when we think about, for example, how polarized we are, or how strong our beliefs are about a political party or about policy issues in one particular direction or another, we know that more and less educated individuals think differently about politics. This gets back to what I was previously just talking to you about related to how college education can oftentimes change individuals and move them in a more progressive direction. So I encourage you to check out this article because what it illustrates is that those individuals, for example, who have a postgraduate education, the highest levels of education you can, are much more likely to be, for example, consistently liberal compared to those with just some college education or high school or less education. And what you can see here is that they're in that mixed category to being slightly more conservative than more educated members of the population. So again, I encourage you to check out this particular article. It should be great reference material later on for those important AP government essays that you will have to write. We'll give you additional context about the importance of education in political socialization. I hope you can get an idea after reading the article about the liberalizing effects of college education, as well as the Pew Research Center data that looks at how these effects extend beyond college, as well as the C-SPAN Archives video looking at the 1992 mock presidential election, that these particular moments in our educational processes are very important for understanding how we're socialized to politics. The next one is equally important, also equally around us, and we marinate in it on a regular basis, and that is the media system that we are a part of. We know, for example, and I'm going to throw a few terms here at you. So we know, for example, that traditional media, television and newspapers, and new media, the internet, or other types of more personalized mobile platforms help to form our political identities. Why, you might ask? It's the access to information. So both traditional and new media give us a ton of information at our fingertips. And because of this, just like our educational processes, we're exposed to new information and potentially new thoughts arise about the political process. We also know that we have possible interactions with other like-minded and or non-like-minded individuals in newer media formats. So you might be on Twitter, you might be on Snapchat, you might be conversing with someone on Facebook who doesn't agree with you about the political process and get into a very interesting debate about something that's occurring in the halls of the US Congress. Because of this, media is acting as a socializing factor. It's exposing you to information that you wouldn't otherwise know about. So we know that in a lot of ways, growing up, the media that we encounter, particularly the millennial generation with new media, is going to be very important for how these groups of individuals, younger individuals, affiliate with the political process over the next 10, 20, 30 years. When we think as well about news media, so those particular media sources, for example, like the New York Times or Vox or Fox News or CNN, these also can have an important socializing effect on us. So the portrayal of elected officials, positively or negatively, can influence our attitudes about, for example, trust in government or expectations of political leaders and other policy views. So, for example, researchers found that the president is much more likely to be covered than Congress on the evening network news. So that's ABC, NBC, CBS. That's the news that's on in the evening right around dinner time if you're in the East Coast or Central Standard Time. But what we also know is that because the president is so focused on in these particular media, individuals can come to develop unrealistic expectations of presidential leadership. So individuals can develop more negative attitudes about Congress because it's not covered as much, and individuals inflate their attitudes about what the president can do because the president is covered much more frequently in news media. Again, you start to get an idea here of how our thinking is influenced by what we see and how often we see information about politics in the news media. Finally, I want to briefly mention to you that our entertainment media choices also have a very important effect. So fictional dramas on television, movies, and other types of entertainment sources can influence our attitudes about government and politics. So if you are someone who maybe plays video games or is a gamer, that in the 2008 election, President Barack Obama's campaign became the first presidential campaign to actually have political advertisements in online video games. So very interesting way to come to understand how entertainment politics can also influence us. When we think about political dramas, for example, like The West Wing, which was a popular show on NBC in the 2000s, or other political dramas like Scandal or Veep that are presently in the media environment, these can also have a very important effect in terms of whether or not we become more cynical about the political process. I've included a link to a New Yorker article here that takes you through, for example, how The West Wing, a show about an idealized version of the presidency and politics, that was on NBC in the 2000s, has had a very important influence on a particular subset of generation of millennials and Generation Xers. This New Yorker article, The West Wing Dream of Democracy by Ian Crouch, looks specifically at this show that was on air on NBC in the 2000s and looks at how it shaped attitudes about the American political process. specifically how it presented an idealized view of how government and politics should work in the United States. It will give you an interesting idea about how these types of shows that we oftentimes want to watch more with popcorn and maybe a can of soda can also at the same time have indirect influences or even direct influences on how we come to understand the political process. So as you just saw with the New Yorker article about the West Wing, as well as what we've talked about here with media, the news media that we encounter on a regular basis, the communication technologies that we encounter, have a very critical influence in terms of how we relate to the American political process. So this, combined with our educational processes, are also very important in thinking about how we come to know politics in our daily lives. Next, though, I want to talk about thinking about our political beliefs and the specific political beliefs that ultimately might influence how we come to relate to the American political process. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video when we'll be talking about things, for example, like our political efficacy and what that means and why that is important for how we might vote or how we might participate in other ways in the political process.